Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a interesting gentleman who's written with a couple of other co-authors a very provocative and interesting article in the Globe and Mail recently. Alexander Lanoszka, who is an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, and his article was about where the United States priorities are today, and it was really quite hard hitting. And if I could quote from the article, what he says is that Trump's tough talk of the 51st state and Governor Trudeau is dangerous. The annexation rhetoric belies what is happening beneath the surface, which is even more dangerous because it is more likely constitutes the real threat. And he says what the White House's budgetary aspirations indicate is not an expansionist and imperialistic America, but an insular, enfeebled, and politically divided country that harks back to the 1920s and the 1930s. Wow. Professor Lanoszka, thank you so much. Welcome for the show.
Thank you for having me.
So the 1920s and the 1930s was, a time of nationalism, of protectionism, of, as you say, insular. It led to the Great Depression. It was, the tariff walls that really destroyed North America and the world. You really think we're back there?
Not necessarily. I think there is still a lot that is contingent. The White House has certain budgetary aspirations that are redolent of some of the policies that we have seen in the 1920s and the 1930s, namely the protectionism that you mentioned. However, we have to bear in mind that, firstly, the Republicans have a very slim majority in Congress, the slimmest since 1931, and so they can only suffer a few defections. We have to bear in mind that business and international commerce are much more integrated than in the 1920s and the 1930s. And indeed, we have been seeing some mild pushback to date from various business interests as regards to the trade disputes that the United States has with Canada, Mexico, and China. But I think there is some worrisome signs to the extent that the president of the United States believes that a certain golden era was afoot when the United States had these barriers, when it was much more insular than not, when it did not have the sort of deployments abroad. But again, we do live in a very different world. I don't want to overstate the similarities. There's a danger in overreaching for analogs, but there are those worrying signs that prompted us to write the article in the way that we did.
You said that we're in a Jerry Springer-like moment between Canada and the United States. Really? Seriously, Jerry Springer-like time?
Well, again, I think we're being a little provocative, but I do think that there's a tendency in Canada to overthink certain matters. Uh, it is obviously very worrisome as we write that the Trump administration has adopted this sort of rhetoric that it has as regards to Canada's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. And indeed, it has besmirched the territorial integrity of other countries. That is a bad thing. The United States does not do that, and it hasn't done that for at least a century. But again, if we look at what is required to go about territorial annexation. We don't see any of the makings of territorial annexation afoot. We don't see troop deployments. We don't see anything that would require large scale
Thank
or
God.
even minor scale land seizures. Nothing of that sort is afoot. And indeed, the reason that we wrote that piece in the first place is precisely because the budgetary aspirations articulated by key members of cabinet and really the White House have indicated that they want to move away from engagement in Europe, for example, to issues more closer to home as regards to the Western Hemisphere. So with the aspiration of cutting maybe 10% of the defense budget in a way that would be much more serious than what would happen in sequestration during the Obama years, there'll be very little aptitude to undertake the sort of expansionistic territorial aggrandizement suggested by the rhetoric. Again, I don't want to say that the rhetoric is benign and we should not care about it. That's not at all what I'm saying. Or that, as some critics of ours have argued, that we're actually in favor of the United States being extremely interventionist abroad. That's, again, not what we're saying. But we are saying that the United States has built up a system of alliances and a network of military deployments in the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic specifically that have been arguably, in our view, positive for the stability of those particular regions.
So, some people on my show have said that, if you had to compare what Trump is saying versus what Putin is saying, he's been, commenting about Greenland the same way that Putin commented about Crimea, the critically important from a national defense standpoint and an access to an important waterway, the Black Sea for Russia and the North Atlantic for the United States. Panama being another example of access through the Black Sea down to the Mediterranean, and Canada versus Ukraine, similar kind of an attitude that it's an imaginary line, it's an artificial line where similar language, similar country, similar legal system, etc. Did Canada ever exist? Did Ukraine ever exist? But you're saying because he hasn't massed forces, land forces on the borders, even
That's
though he's threatened
yeah.
economic coercion, you're saying don't worry, Brian.
Well, firstly, I think we have to back up a little bit. So there is an international relations literature on territorial annexation or territorial disputes, and the vast majority of disputes involve territories that are very small in proportion to the states disputing over them. The sort of mass territorial aggrandizement of the sort that we've seen, say, with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, Germany vis-a-vis Poland in the 1930s and 40s, that's very, very rare. Most states are not maximalist. Uh, and so already that should cast some doubt as to the actual aspirations of the Trump administration. Moreover, I would say that even Trump himself has put military force off the table as regards to Canada. He said that he wants to use economic force instead.
Economic
There's no,
coercion.
he said economic force in one speech, and indeed, there is zero instance of territorial aggrandizement that has arisen as a result of simply economic force. It just does not happen. You need to have boots on the ground. You need to have uh, troops deployed that hold territory and so forth. Nothing of that sort is afoot, at least not with Canada. Maybe military plans are being drawn up with Panama. I'd also say I've seen the same arguments about Ukraine and Canada being drawn up to make that sort of comparison. I think that again overlooks the political importance that Ukraine as an object has had for Russian conservatives over the decades, if not the centuries. We have nothing like that between Canada and the United States. From the perspective of a number of American decision makers, even in the 19th century, there's a sense that Canada is just too large and too complex of a society to really absorb. You have Quebec for one. You have a constituency that would be left of center, at least relative to the American spectrum. That would be obviously very complicated for the Republican Party to countenance. We don't see any of the consistent sense of ownership on the part of American leaders vis-a-vis Canada as Russian leaders in the Kremlin at present have had vis-a-vis Ukraine. So there is that comparison. And to be sure, Russian leaders have seized upon Trump's rhetoric of territorial aggrandizement to justify what they're doing in Ukraine. But again, I think the similarity is at best a superficial one.
You say, and I quote, put simply, these budget priorities coupled with the neo-mercantilist and zero-sum rhetoric of the Trump administration on trade suggest a retrenchment to the Western Hemisphere and a tacit recognition of Russian and Chinese claims to their alleged spheres of influence. Are we going to a world that is not a G7 or G20, but a big three?
It's possible. Again, I would like to think that international society has become a lot more interconnected and complex that would put the brakes on such endeavors. We're not in the 19th century anymore on a number of dimensions. I do think, though, that leaders like the President of the United States right now prefer to engage with other leaders. They see those sorts of interpersonal relations as being extremely valuable. And as such, they're going to be fairly critical of international institutions or international laws, if not international norms as well. And so there might be a tendency to speak over the heads of some countries because they might matter less in their view in their interlocutions with leaders of the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China and so forth and so forth.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with our expert professor in just 2 minutes, talking about what we can read from the American budgetary priorities. And he's saying that we should be, I guess, less worried about some of this rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump. We should be taking a look at the numbers. And it sort of harkens back to the follow the money kind of line that we've heard before. Maybe it's show me the money before you worry about whether Donald Trump is as expansionist and as imperialistic as I'm worried about and as some people are worried about. We're going to take a break and be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Alexander Lanoszka. He's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, and he's written a very interesting article with some co-authors in the Globe recently about Donald Trump, about the United States, that has been less concerned about some of his imperialistic rhetoric and saying you got to take a look at the budget. And it's interesting because what you're suggesting is that because they're trying to cut the budget and trying to cut some of the foreign spending, that we shouldn't be worried. But then you say that actually is a big risk. Let me quote again. An insular, if not isolationist administration is nearly as grave a geopolitical risk to the world's democracies as an imperialistic one. That's interesting. After all, the U.S.'s forward deployments and active diplomatic engagement abroad have helped secure Canada, Europe, and the West Pacific since the 1950s. The Trump administration is now choosing to put that security in jeopardy. If this pattern holds, then European NATO allies, Canada, and other like-minded states must manage their own security affairs, giving them a kind of agency that arguably has not existed since the U.S. entered the Second World War. So it's interesting. Initially people were worried that the U.S. and Donald Trump wanted to expand. Then you're arguing, no, the U.S. is becoming insular and reducing its influence. And you're saying that's just as much of a risk.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily want to bore your listeners with my own academic research, but my first book was about how the United States managed issues relating to nuclear proliferation on the part of its own treaty allies. And basically, the finding, as it were, was that those allies were looking for assurances on the part of the United States to provide them with security, usually in the form of nuclear deterrence. After all, it's the United States that has the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. But of course, promises of providing nuclear deterrence are fundamentally unbelievable because war is really, really expensive, especially a nuclear war. It's easier to just back up, even in a crisis. And so what countries are looking for is whether the United States has skin in the game, meaning whether the United States has positioned forces of its own on the territory of those allies, such that A, they would fight against the adversary, in this case, the Russian Federation, but in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and put its own forces at risk, such that if American soldiers die, that would invite some sort of retaliatory response. So if the United States were to recast this architecture of security assurances and some military support that has built up since the 1950s. It has changed, to be sure, of course, since then, in a way that'll be very dramatic and done in a manner without consultations, in a very unilateral manner, the sort suggested by those working in the Pentagon or even at the White House at the moment, then that could be destabilizing and could trigger realignment on the part of those countries. It could trigger reconsideration of their own stances towards nuclear weapons. I don't think we're there, to be sure. I want to make that clear. Countries are not going to go nuclear because they don't like something that Trump said on social media per se. But that could be the risk. And what we want to do in this op-ed that I published with Richard Shimuka and Balkan Devlin is to basically highlight those potential risks because those might be much more probable than, say, a full-scale invasion of the United States on Canada. I just don't see that latter scenario happening.
So it's interesting. What you're saying is that effectively what you're saying is that this promise of nuclear security wasn't believable, and so therefore you really want troops and or economic investment in the country such that the United States has something at risk, and so maybe this investment in critical minerals that Ukraine was being offered by the United States actually. If Donald Trump had some real estate investment in Ukraine, he would be even more motivated to assist and secure their security, secure their borders than if they had a nuclear power security. Now, let me ask you, it's interesting to me. The European Union is about 500 million people, and Russia's only about 140 million people. Ukraine is 40 million people, and even though they're not winning the war, they've done a reasonably good job of not being beaten and holding Russia to the places where they've held them to. If the European Union, combined or not with Ukraine, got its act together, it's as big, if not bigger, than the United States at 300 million people. It could and should be able to economically support a nuclear defense, a military defense, an economic defense against Russia. And is what the United States is doing by either withdrawing or threatening to withdraw, forcing Europe to get its act together and stand up and put its big boy pants on?
So that has indeed been the argument made by those of the so-called restraint school in the United States, arguing for some form of retrenchment. The Europeans are rich enough, they're prosperous enough, they've been free riding, so to speak, on American assurances. They have the capacity to go about deterring foreign adversaries on their own right, precisely because they're rich and so prosperous. That is very true, and there's much to be said for it. I think the one issue with that particular argument right now, maybe less so in 2025 than what might have been the case in 2017, is the situation of what some would call strategic cacophony. Oh my God, I should know how to pronounce that word, cacophony, whereby you have 30 European NATO countries, and they don't all have the same interests. They don't have the same threat perceptions. They vary in terms of their economic development or even attachment to democracy, one can say. And so you have multiple voices pulling the union in different directions. And indeed, that was true even in the interwar period, if we dare invoke that particular historical analogy. What the United States does is basically overcome that situation of strategic cacophony, whereby Europeans are not able to collectively act together precisely because there are just too many differences among them. And so what the United States does by being a land power in Europe is effectively resolve that collective action problem by providing a source of stability, being a clearinghouse for information and military technology, as well as providing the guarantor or guarantee of last resort to smooth over those differences, provide that sort of cohesion and unity that might otherwise be absent. Otherwise, it could be the case that European allies would scatter. Yes, in aggregate, they have all of those advantages vis-a-vis the Russian Federation, but only if they act cohesively and in a unified manner. And the European record, unfortunately, suggests that it is very difficult to achieve.
But it seems like really what has happened in the last couple of weeks is they haven't scattered. If anything, they become more unified. And Germany actually saying that they may need to go to France and the UK for effectively a nuclear deterrent promise. Is this working in the favor of Europe? Trump's withdrawal, is this strengthening Europe? It looks like they're coming together.
Yeah, and to be sure, the United States has not withdrawn from Europe. It's just the specter of disengagement that hangs in the air. There have been no calls for any retrenchment or withdrawal of American forces. Those have been considered in the final days or months of the first Trump administration, and we might see those plans come back into the books. But right now, the conversation in Europe is about how the United States has been dealing with Ukraine, negotiating over that country's head to a certain degree with Russia, and how that has caused those European countries to mobilize and to provide increasing support to Ukraine as well as to themselves should that very contingency were ever to arise. So yes, at the moment they appear very concerned, and I think, in fact, that's good news for the United States. The United States wants those allies to work more and more together and to develop more and more capabilities up until a certain point, to be sure, as regards to how the United States thinks about these issues. Does not necessarily want to see a third power center in Europe, but all the same, yes, the Europeans have been acting in this way. It remains to be seen how long they can keep this up, though.
You've got another paragraph, though, in your article that really calls into question Trump's strategy vis-a-vis what Europe might want, and that is sort of the Munich strategy. And you say, Mr. Trump's first term in office offered a preview of today's short-sighted and cynical approach. He personally desired a U.S. exit from Afghanistan and so negotiated a highly flawed agreement with the Taliban to facilitate the withdrawal of American forces without Kabul's participation, effectively dooming that country. The same dynamics are now at play in Ukraine with his détente with Moscow and his sudden decision to end military aid. Mr. Trump wants to wash his hands of the war rather than actually end it, which will lead to a peace reminiscent of the 1938 Munich Agreement that paved the way for the total surrender of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. You're talking about Judas wash his hands and Chamberlain in regards to Munich. This isn't good for Ukraine or Europe. He's certainly not being Churchill here.
Bear in mind that we wrote this piece in mid to late February. And indeed,
that was 2 weeks ago.
Well, it's a very fluid environment. Things do change very quickly, sometimes for the better, oftentimes for the worse, but they do change. And in mid-February through late February, there was a lot of dismay, to put it mildly, over how the U.S. Vice President spoke about European security at the Munich Security Conference. There was, of course, the Riyadh summit between the United States and Russia. It seemed like the United States was conceding a lot to Russia without really extracting any concessions on the Russian side, aside from maybe a few prisoner releases. And of course, it did temporarily suspend military aid to Ukraine for over a week or so, not that long ago. So it's an extremely fluid environment, and that in itself is indicative what some might consider that lack of strategy that we identify. I think the first Trump administration had a lot more stability in its foreign relations conduct, at least in the first 2 years, at least relative to what we're seeing these days. We see this indeed in the trade dispute between the two countries, between our two countries, the United States and Canada. But with regards to Europe, you have voices articulating support for NATO, and the need for Europe to remain strong in the face of Russian aggression. The G7 foreign ministers conference in Charleroi just the other day speaks to that sense of continuity. But then you also see other aspects of the Trump administration's foreign policy that are much more chaotic, more troublesome, more unpredictable, and so forth and so forth. And that can create a sense of instability, and indeed could create instability just on that basis alone.
Fascinating. It's almost as if you're worried about America spending too much money on national defense and being too involved in the world, and you're also worried about it spending too little and being too little involved in the world. It's both issues. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with our expert, Associate Professor Alexander Lanoszka of the University of Waterloo, talking about what the heck is going on in the United States with its defense budget and its involvement or lack thereof in international relations. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Alexander Lanoszka, an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, is my guest tonight. We're talking about the U.S. Expenditures on defense and commitment to international relations. And I was saying that you were arguing it should be you're arguing it should be spending more, even though some people think that then it's imperialistic. And then you're
Well,
arguing that
yeah.
the risk is that it's spending too little. So
No, no, no. We don't argue that the United States should be spending more necessarily. That's not the argument. It's how you spend the money, right? If the United States decides to cut uh, its defense expenditures at a certain point, then that could compromise combat readiness. It could mean the withdrawal of certain forces from particular theaters, like those in Europe and even in the West Pacific. That could create instability in those regions. Uh, if the United States were to stand pat or spend a lot more, but on issues related to Western hemispheric defense, like Golden Dome, for instance, as what the president has said, then that could be still at the expense of what the United States is doing in the Indo-Pacific and in the Euro-Atlantic regions. That could be destabilizing. As such, it could mean that the United States is trying to create Fortress America. It could also mean that the United States is developing capabilities to really uh, go about the sort of territorial aggrandizement that some of its leaders have been discussing vis-a-vis Canada and elsewhere. So we're not saying that the United States should be spending more money on defense, and that itself would be a good thing. Although there have been Republicans to that effect arguing that the United States should spend more money in order to counter threats from Russia and China. There are Republicans, indeed, to that effect. And that may indeed be conducive to international stability, although, of course, there may be some listeners who don't see it that way. But all the same, if it's going towards building up um, networks of deterrence and defense measures involving allies in the West Pacific and in Europe, then that could indeed be a good thing. If it's going towards imperialistic endeavors like the sort maybe we have seen arguably in the early 2000s with Iraq, then yes, that could be very, very problematic. So I just want to be careful as to what we're arguing and how people might view our argument.
I got to ask you about another article you've written, if I could. I was just a couple of minutes ago comparing what's going on right now with Donald Trump and his negotiation with Russia as comparable to Munich, and Chamberlain going to Munich and giving Nazi Germany Czechoslovakia, and saying peace in our time, and effectively surrendering and giving in to Nazi Germany, and that Russia might be doing the same. You then wrote an article about something I don't even know about, so I'd be interested in what the comparison is. You said NATO faces its Daladier moment following Munich, where you said that European NATO should avoid the helpless despair that befell Eduardo Daladier in 1938. Tell us what the analogy is.
Sure. So the common understanding of Munich is that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain conceded parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenlands, to Nazi Germany in the hope that it would effectively appease Hitler, and Hitler would have no further appetite for territorial aggrandizement in Central Europe. And he went back to London and he proudly declared that he had secured peace in our time. And all of this is sort of premised on this notion that uh, Chamberlain was very naive about the threat and was very hubristic in how he felt he handled that particular threat. But the other thing that people miss about the Munich conference in September 1938 is that the French president was very much present. His name was Edouard Daladier, and he actually had a very keen sense of the threat that Nazi Germany had presented. In fact, his country, unlike Britain's, had a treaty commitment to Czechoslovakia. Nevertheless, he felt like he was unable to act, and he was unable to act because he did not have British support. This is a sense that he had, notwithstanding how Germany was not at all prepared to fight. In fact, maybe France was better prepared than he believed, even though France, of course, had suffered problems. And so he sort of went along with Chamberlain, and he effectively agreed to the appeasement of Hitler and the cession of Sudetenland to Nazi Germany. And he knew full well that this was a bad thing. He knew that the Nazis would not necessarily be appeased, that they did constitute a real challenge to European security. But again, he felt helpless, he felt despair. And so, rather famously, at least in French circles, when he flew back to Paris and he saw crowds greeting him, he basically said, in French, ce sont des cons, ils savent pas. That means to say that these are idiots, they don't know, right?
He
Very
said, what? These are
different.
idiots?
Basically, that yeah, at least the anecdote is that these are basically idiots, right? Ils sont cons.
Referring to Chamberlain.
No, that he referred to members of the French public who gathered near the airport, being so happy that they were able to diffuse a war scare that took place in Europe at that time. So he understood very well the stakes involved. He understood the threat environment, but he felt helpless, and he was just so immersed in his despair that the rest is history. And the reason why I wrote this piece is precisely because I feared that European leaders, because they felt like they didn't have the support of the United States in going about certain issues in their own neighborhood, would feel that sense of despair, would be paralyzed from acting and not do anything. I don't think that's the case, to be sure, but when I wrote that piece, I had that concern in mind. And I think when I look back on the last 10 years, I think there is a tendency on the part of Western decision makers to punt on particular geopolitical problems, thinking that the United States is absolutely essential, which it is, to be sure, but thinking that it is so essential that they can't really do anything in its absence. And so I was worried that European decision makers might be paralyzed, that they might be running around with their heads on fire or hair on fire. And really, there is much clarity as to what to do, despite what people say about we're living in times of deep uncertainty. I don't think that's the case. I think we actually live in a lot of certainty. But that was the motivation that was behind that particular piece.
So that's interesting. Do you think, therefore, that Europe, without U.S. support, could defend Ukraine and or ensure Ukrainian victory in this war?
It'll be very difficult under the present circumstances. The United States provides about 40% of military assistance to Ukraine. And the Ukrainian defense industry has become much more self-sufficient since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. Again, it brings us back to this issue of strategic cacophony. You have multiple voices, multiple understandings of the conflict itself. It does not have the unified mass as the United States does. The European defense industry, at least on certain platforms, has been very fragmented and under-resourced. That's slowly changing. That, in fact, was somewhat true of the United States all the same, but the United States has been consistently spending a lot on defense. And indeed, in other research, I found that with Jordan Becker of West Point, that countries that spend a lot on their operations and maintenance, basically training and so forth, were those that were most able to deliver military assistance to Ukraine in 2022. They were strategically prepared. The United States was one of those countries that was strategically prepared. The countries closest to Russia, the Baltics, Poland, and so forth, were also strategically prepared because they had made those investments. But other countries within European NATO lacked those investments. They didn't spend as much on operations and maintenance or their defense more broadly, and as such, they were insufficient. I think Europe, since 2022, has gone better, but it's still nowhere near to replacing in full what the United States could provide.
I think it's a really interesting analogy that you've made. I guess I worry about and I think about the role that Poland and the Baltic states are playing right now and should be playing. I think that when you think about what happened to Poland in 1939 and 1940, they would have been a lot better off to defend Czechoslovakia a year earlier and support. And so you think about Poland and the Baltics now, rather than being attacked a year from now, they'd be a lot better off supporting Ukraine, and I think they are. And so, what's your recommendation to those countries in NATO on the eastern flank?
Well, they understand the threat environment extremely well. There's a lot of social buy-in in support of increasing defense expenditures, and many of those countries are actually in excess of 2.5, if not 3%,
Poland's almost
of
at
their
5%,
gross.
is it not?
Yes, that might be temporary. This is all financed in various ways too. Poland is financing defense expenditures by way of debt. Estonia and Latvia have introduced temporary taxes to support these endeavors. So far, this has popular support, but that could change. And even within Poland, there is a national conversation about the sustainability of such extensive investment precisely because there are very real guns versus butter trade-offs here. With regards to Western European countries, their growth prospects are a little more limited. They have not really had the sort of productivity gains unleashed by advances in computing and artificial intelligence as what we have seen in the United States. Canada is similarly stymied by a lack of economic productivity vis-a-vis the United States. And so that's going to put constraints on the ability of those countries to come up with the necessary investments. But I think we're at the position where we know what the threat environment is. We have a stronger sense of how fickle the United States is. The United States still shows up. It showed up big time in 2022 to a certain extent as regards to European security. The Biden administration did have 100,000 troops on the continent, up from about 65 just 2 years before. So 65,000. So the United States is just fickle, right? And one way of just future-proofing oneself is just develop more capabilities and more capacity. It's simple as that.
So Canada's got to get up to 2% spending right away. Europe's got to get up to that, if not above that.
Yes, but even with respect to Canada spending 2%, it's probably nowhere near as sufficient, quite honestly, in part because we've neglected our defense capabilities for so long that even reaching 2% will not address the capability gaps that now exist.
So you also in your article talk about how Trump doesn't have as much power as we think he
Potentially,
does
yeah.
because of the slim majority. He talks about, I won every swing state, I won the House, I won the Senate, I won the presidency, I won the popular vote. You're suggesting that he doesn't have that power. Do you think there's a Winston Churchill in in the United States right now? Is there someone like Winston Churchill that could stand up to Chamberlain?
Well, firstly, my co-authors and I do go back and forth on how strong Trump is. At the moment, he is strong for the reasons that you mentioned, and Congress to date has been very compliant, especially in the Senate, on issues that should have been probably much more contentious, like, say, the appointment of particular cabinet positions or cabinet nominees like Hegseth, for example, for Secretary of Defense. But all the same, Congress has been relatively compliant. How compliant Congress will be remains to be seen. The tariffs are going to sink in and whatever effects they'll have on the American economy. I think it's not unreasonable to conclude from the last few weeks that the United States might suffer from increasing unemployment and increasing prices. In other words, stagflation of the sort seen in the 1970s. That's going to cut into lawmakers' own re-election prospects, even those younger Republicans who have joined Congress since 2020. So at the moment, the Trump administration does have an electoral mandate. I know people don't like to hear that, but it does. Yet it does bear repeating that the congressional majority is very slim, the slimmest since 1931. They can only suffer a handful of
Sorry, the
elections.
slimmest since 1931?
Yes. I forget the precise numbers, but you can look it up on Wikipedia. There are only a few more Republican lawmakers in Congress than there are Democrats. And so it's not unreasonable to conclude that the Democrats could win in 2026. That being said, in the midterm elections. But that being said, The Democrats lack leadership. They don't seem to coordinate. I've
They held up all
observed
those paddles during the State of the Union.
that's not sufficient. But I think one thing we do
They
know is
waved their
that,
cane.
yeah, that's not protest, right? So in 2017, there was a lot of protests against the Trump administration. And there have been some protests lately in the last 2 months, especially in view of all the federal workforce layoffs. But it's a far cry from what we've seen in 2017. That doesn't reflect well on the political opposition. Um, I'm Polish by way of parentage, and I was in 2015 when very similar discussions about democracy were being had there, as we see in the United States right now. But civil society was much more mobile, much more mobilized, much more in opposition on the streets and so forth, in ways that are clearly lacking right now in the United States. That could change as people get unemployed, when their savings dissipate and so forth and so forth. Consumer confidence is cratering, according to recent surveys. So that could have effects, but we might not see those effects for quite some time.
Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank
This
you
has
for
been a
having me.
fascinating conversation. I
Thank you.
appreciate the articles that you've written. I think that it's interesting that you challenge us to think that the United States plays this important role geopolitically. We may not want it to overspend in certain areas and become imperialistic, but we also don't want it to underspend and just remove itself from geopolitical issues. And your point about where it spends the money and its commitment with troops on the ground, more than just this nuclear protection promise that may not be real, I think is an important one. I really enjoyed your analogy back to this French president back in 1938 that I didn't know about, and understood that maybe Europe is in a similar situation today, and it's got to take that different attitude. And I appreciate your comments about this slim majority, and so maybe what we need in North America today is some of those Democrats to stand up with some backbone.
Well, I would
It
say
comes
that,
back to, do we have
yeah.
that Churchill?
Well, I would say that Doug Ford has imposed more costs on the Republican Party than the Democrats have in 2 years. But I appreciate
Sorry,
the
what'd you
challenge
say? Doug
that
Ford?
has imposed more costs on the Republican Party than the Democrats have in 2 years. But all the same, I appreciate the conversation. The challenge is mutual. I really like the questions that forces me to think through
That's
these
our
things.
show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.